And good morning, everyone. Hi, this is David Cross with you. And one more personal project today that I found interesting that DNS administrators, security administrators specifically, might find interesting. And while I was on the topic of DNS TAP yesterday and processing MongoDB and having the queries and reports, I thought, well, this might be a good time to introduce some of the capabilities you can have out there with other services, like a company called WhoisAPI. So this is kind of an unsolicited um, a video about this company's product, which I think turns out to be a pretty cool thing for security administrators. And especially when it comes down to identifying specifically domain information when processing logs and determining who queries are going to and so forth. Now, I'm only interacting with one particular API. However, they do have several, and they then go through different types of APIs and functions that within your organization you might find useful. So if you're looking at service providers and IP blocks, you might be interested in pulling back some of the ASN number information, geolocation if you're trying to tie it back to physical areas, and then maybe even brand alerts for those companies who want to see how your brands are in terms of someone stealing your domains or using that. So it's a pretty cool company. I haven't worked into the other different feeds and options yet, but you can sign up for free, and you can they'll give you a certain number of free queries, at least from a development, and then you'll register for a key that you can use within the API. So again, unsolicited. I don't sell or work with them or affiliated, but I found it and I found it useful. So one of the things I thought would be useful too is to have a API that, like with similar other functions I have, to be able to use a MongoDB for storage, but more specifically because I have a very limited number of API accounts, to have the ability that if I'm sending out queries, instead of going out and hitting that service externally every time, then I would hit it just one time initially, determine if the query has ever been asked before, go out and perform the lookup if it has not, and store it back into a MongoDB so the next time it gets queried, it can be cached and looked up locally. So I'm not going to show you the API key. You'll need to set that up initially. But what I do have here is a function effectively that I was using a URL that I could do this through an API remotely, but I'm going to show you how to do it locally. So effectively the URL that you would have then is the Whois service that runs on the WhoisXmlAPI site. There's various parameters they expect within their query that you would define for things like domain name, your API key. Now I'm passing this to an inject node, so I didn't have to store it in this file to videotape this. And also the output is JSON, which I want in my structure. So in here, we're going to format the URL to be effectively the necessary parameters that I can query the Whois database, and then take that information and store the payload. And this payload is effectively saying that the Whois record domain name, which is the property, is this domain name. And when this gets passed into the payload, it sends it directly to Mongo. The MongoDB node is set up to do a find, and it's going to try and find that Whois record with the domain name. And if it does match a domain name, instead of having to go out and query the database again, it just simply passes the information out to the returning result. So if I was doing this through a web, it would be through the web API get and then out, or through the debug here. So I have one set up, and I'm not going to go out and pull out any particular company in general or any of the particular domains with the exception of one, and that is Node-RED, since we're looking at Node-RED as a function. So I sent in basically the domain name, nodered.org, and queried their API, and it pulls back the specific registrant data and things like the registry dates and times and who your contacts and name servers are. But there's also information in here that might give you things that you can use to determine maybe the validity of the company or some type of ranking value of how old their domain is. You know, if this says it's 1 day, you know, you might be a spam or a phisher, but somebody that's 2,000 days, the estimated age, that's a relatively established or domain name in many cases. Now, a lot of these are effectively going to have stripped out information. Like my website, I have registered domains, but I'm an individual, I'm not a company, so I redact that information, and I actually pay to have it removed, and it won't give you any meaning back. So you'll have to kind of use this with caution and be careful too about what you use in terms of the number of queries and testing. And if you're interested in the pricing, they do have the solution here. If you click through the Whois API, the pricing guide, it seems pretty straightforward. 2,000 queries a month, 15 bucks. You get down here into some big, bigger sites, and you start looking at, external queries, and you might want to have, a little bit bigger subscription in your organization to do this type of lookup. So anyway, that's a quick video, and I just wanted to show that because I thought it was, relatively important here to security administrators as we're kind of pulling all these different functions together, and especially like the DNS tab. I can then go back as I'm pulling out the different domains and reports. I can further go out and query against that Whois information, and if I have a reasonable API key, I can tell it to do this X number of thousands of times, and it won't matter, and I won't have to pay too much for that. But again, I'm using a developer account. But anyway, something interesting and kind of pulling all the information together. And maybe at some point, as I progress through this, I'll have one application that has all of these different functions that will provide back different details based on the need that we pass into the query. So anyway, take care. And I have a couple other things I want to cover going back into some of my evaluation series videos and things like the call out manager and others. So look out for those if you have the link for that playlist. Anyway, take care, and we'll talk to you soon.